The alien girl reunites with the human soldier, who saved her years before the war had been raging across the galaxy for years. The Earth Coalition, a group of human colonies united to defend their homeworld, was locked in a deadly struggle against the Thraxians, a ruthless alien empire. Planets were falling, and entire civilizations were being wiped out. The skies above Earth had turned dark with the smoke of war, and every day brought new horrors. On one such day, the battle was taking place on the remote planet of Ethra, a world on the edge of the Earth Coalition's reach. It was a small, isolated planet, but to the soldiers of the Earth Coalition, it was a key strategic point. If they could hold it, they could slow down the Thraxian advance. If they failed, they would lose everything. Sergeant David Hawk had seen his fair share of battles. A soldier for most of his life, he had fought in wars on multiple planets. But this battle, this war, felt different. The Thraxians weren't just attacking, they were systematically erasing whole populations. David stood among his squad on the rocky, desolate landscape of Ethra, scanning the horizon through his rifle's sight. His mind was focused, sharp. The Thraxians had sent wave after wave of soldiers, but David was used to this. He had been through worse. As the battle raged on, a sudden explosion threw him off his feet. He quickly scrambled back up, his heart pounding as his squad mates shouted orders over the noise of gunfire and explosions. The dust in the air stung his eyes, but he forced himself to look ahead. That's when he saw her. A girl, barely more than a child, was running across the battlefield. She was thin and frail, with bright, striking green eyes and strange markings across her skin. Her clothes were torn and she was stumbling, desperate. Behind her, a group of Thraxian soldiers were advancing, their weapons raised. David didn't think. He moved without hesitation, his training kicking in. His squad mates shouted, urging him to stay focused, to follow orders, but David was already in motion. His rifle barked, taking down one of the Thraxians in a clean shot, but there were still more. He sprinted toward the girl, who was struggling to stay on her feet. She looked at him with a mix of fear and confusion. David reached her just as a Thraxian soldier aimed his weapon at her. Without thinking, he shoved her aside, taking the full brunt of the shot to his shoulder. The impact sent him sprawling, but the girl was safe. David grunted in pain as he staggered to his feet, clutching his shoulder. The girl was now kneeling beside him, her wide eyes full of uncertainty. She didn't speak. She didn't know what to do, but David knew. He had to get her out of here. "Stay close," David grunted, his voice rough with pain. He reached down, grabbing the girl's hand. She didn't pull away, but there was still a look of hesitation in her eyes. He began dragging her toward the nearest cover, a small rocky outcrop, all the while firing his rifle to keep the Thraxians at bay. He could hear the sound of explosions, the cries of his comrades, but he couldn't focus on that now. The girl needed him. When they reached the cover, David collapsed behind the rocks, panting and blood dripping from his shoulder. The girl sat beside him, trembling but silent. She was watching him closely, her gaze intelligent, filled with an understanding that didn't belong to someone so young. David wiped the sweat from his brow and looked at her, realizing that he had no idea who she was, where she came from, or why she was here. But none of that mattered now. He had made a promise to himself to protect her. If he could get her off this planet, he would. The girl finally spoke, her voice soft and alien, but there was an unmistakable human quality to her tone. "Why?" she asked, her eyes locking onto his. David blinked, confused. "Why what? Why?" "Save me," she repeated, as though it was a question she had been asking herself for a long time. David looked at her, his heart heavy. "Because it's the right thing to do," he answered simply. His words seemed to confuse her more, but he didn't know how else to explain it. The truth was, he didn't need a reason. He had saved her because he could, because he wouldn't let anyone die if he could stop it. The ground shook as another explosion went off nearby. David winced, his head spinning. The Thraxians were closing in, but David had a plan. He would get them to the transport shuttle on the other side of the battlefield. From there, they could escape. But just as he was about to make a move, the sky above them lit up with blinding flashes. A huge Thraxian warship appeared, blocking out the sun. It hovered above them, casting a shadow over the field. David could hear the low hum of its engines, and he knew that the time for escape was running out. "Listen to me," David said urgently, grabbing the girl's arm. "We have to move now, do you understand?" The girl nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but there was no time for hesitation. David stood up, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, and began running. The girl followed, her feet light and quick, but there was a strange hesitation in her every step. She was afraid, he could see that, but she was also determined. They reached the shuttle, and David helped her onto the boarding ramp, making sure she was safely inside. The moment they were both aboard, the doors slammed shut, and the ship's engines roared to life. As the shuttle lifted off, David looked down at the battlefield. He could see the Thraxian soldiers still moving below, but they were no longer a threat. For now, at least, they were safe. The girl was silent beside him, her eyes fixed on the window, watching as the planet of Ithra grew smaller and smaller beneath them. David didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know where they would go or what they would face, but he knew one thing: he had made a promise to her. He would keep it no matter what. "What's your name?" David asked quietly, breaking the silence. She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "Nira," she said softly, almost as though she had to remember the word herself. "I am Nira," David nodded. "Well, Nira, we're not done yet. We'll get you somewhere safe. You'll be okay." Nira didn't answer, but her eyes softened for a moment, just enough for David to catch the fleeting hint of trust in them. He had saved her today, but the war was far from over, and he didn't know if they would ever be able to go back to their old lives. The only thing he knew for sure was that he had made a promise to this girl, and he wasn't about to break it. Years had passed since David and Nira had escaped the battlefield of Ithra. The world they had once known was gone. David had kept his promise to protect Nira, and together they had survived. They had hidden on distant planets, far from the war that raged between the Earth Coalition and the Thraxians, but eventually even the most remote corners of the galaxy couldn't keep them safe. The war had grown worse. The Thraxians, relentless in their expansion, had launched full-scale attacks on Earth. Cities fell. Colonies were destroyed. The once proud human race was on the edge of extinction. David, though scarred and changed by the war, had been by Nira's side throughout it all. But in those quiet moments when the battles paused and the nights grew long, he couldn't stop wondering, was there a chance for peace? Was there a way to stop the Thraxians, who seemed determined to erase humanity once and for all? As time passed, Nira had grown from the scared, confused girl he had rescued on Ithra into a fierce and capable leader. Her name had spread across the galaxy: Nira, the light of the resistance. She had rallied the surviving human colonies, leading attacks against Thraxian strongholds and inspiring others to join the fight. But as much as David admired her strength, he couldn't shake the feeling that the odds were against them. One day, as they sat in a makeshift command center on a hidden colony called Zerk, Nira turned to David, her green eyes reflecting a new determination. "We can't keep running," she said, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of responsibility. "The Thraxians are too strong. I've spent years gathering allies, but it's not enough. I need to strike back and strike hard." David looked at her, his brow furrowed. "You're talking about attacking their homeworld, aren't you?" Nira nodded, her expression unwavering. "We need to destroy their fleet. Without it, they won't be able to keep advancing. If we can break their strength, we might have a chance to end this war." David's heart sank at the thought of a full-scale assault. He had seen what the Thraxians could do, how ruthless they were. But there was something in Nira's eyes that made him trust her. She wasn't just a leader, she was a symbol of hope. And if she believed they could win, then maybe they could. "We're going to need more than just a handful of ships," David said, his voice low. "I know," Neera replied. "I've already contacted the remaining resistance cells. If we can unite them, we can form a fleet capable of taking on the Thraxian Empire. But we need to act fast. The Thraxians are coming for Earth. It's only a matter of time before they reach us." David nodded, his mind racing with plans. As much as he feared the outcome, he knew that this was the only chance they had left. He couldn't sit back and watch humanity fall without fighting for it. And if there was anyone who could lead them to victory, it was Neera. The next few weeks were filled with preparations. They traveled across the galaxy, meeting with resistance leaders, gathering fighters, and securing weapons. But even as their fleet grew, David couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading into a trap. The Thraxians were cunning, and they knew that a united resistance force would be their greatest threat. Still, he pushed his doubts aside. Neera needed him, and he would follow her to the ends of the galaxy. On the day they launched their assault, David stood on the bridge of the flagship, staring out at the vastness of space. Neera was beside him, her expression focused as she looked over the tactical displays. "We're almost there," she said, her voice calm but filled with a sense of purpose. "Once we hit the Thraxian fleet, we'll need to move fast. They won't give us a second chance." David's eyes narrowed as he watched the stars outside. "How much time do we have?" "Not long," Neera replied. "We've received intel that the Thraxians are already assembling a counterforce. They're not going to let us hit them without a fight." David clenched his fists, the familiar tension returning. He had fought countless battles, but this felt different. This wasn't just about winning a skirmish. It was about saving everything they had fought for. He looked at Neera, who was so much more than the girl he had saved years ago. She was a leader, a beacon of hope. And in that moment, he knew he would follow her to the ends of the galaxy, no matter what it cost. "We'll make it through," he said, his voice steady. "We have to." The command was given, and the fleet moved into position. The stars outside the viewport blurred as the ships engaged their faster-than-light drives. For what felt like hours, they traveled toward the heart of the Thraxian fleet. David could feel the anticipation building inside him. Every soldier aboard the ships was ready for battle. Every crew member knew the risks, but there was no turning back. As they entered the Thraxian system, the fleet dropped out of warp, and David could see the enemy ships ahead, massive, dark warships that blotted out the stars. The Thraxians had been waiting for them. It was a trap. A series of explosions rocked the fleet as Thraxian fighters swarmed in, their weapons blazing. David's heart pounded as the first wave of enemy ships engaged. The battle was on. David turned to Neera, who was already issuing orders to their fleet. Her calm demeanor in the face of danger was a source of strength for him. He had seen her fight through the darkest times, and he knew she wouldn't back down now. "Focus on their command ships," she instructed, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Take out their leadership, and the rest of the fleet will fall apart." David nodded and moved to the weapons station. He took control of a turret, his hands steady as he fired at the incoming Thraxian fighters. The explosions filled the space around them as they returned fire, but David's focus was absolute. He had to protect Neera. He had to protect their people. As the battle raged, David felt something shift within him. He had fought for survival, for his comrades, for the future of humanity. But now he fought for something deeper. He fought for Neera, for the hope she represented, for the possibility of a future where Earth could rebuild and thrive once more. Hours passed and the battle seemed endless. The Resistance fleet had suffered heavy losses, but they were pushing forward. David could see the Thraxian command ships beginning to fall, one by one. Their grip on the battle was slipping. It wasn't over yet, but victory was within reach. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the last of the Thraxian ships fell. The battlefield was littered with debris, but the Resistance had won. The Thraxians had been driven back. David stood on the bridge, his heart still racing. The battle had been fierce, but it wasn't over yet. There was still a long road ahead. But for the first time in years, David allowed himself a small, hopeful smile. Neera looked at him, her eyes reflecting the same hope. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. But together, they had proven that the Thraxians could be defeated, and that hope could survive, no matter how dark the universe seemed. The war raged on across the galaxy, but there was something different in the air. The Thraxian Empire had suffered a significant blow with the defeat of their flagship fleet, and the Earth Coalition's resistance had gained momentum. Neera, the once innocent girl David had saved all those years ago, was now a leader of the human resistance, fiercely fighting for the survival of her people. But despite her successes, there was always a nagging thought in the back of her mind, a question that haunted her every night. Where is David? After the battle at the Thraxian fleet, they had won. Yet in the back of her mind, Neera had always felt that something was missing. David had been her protector, the one who had saved her when the world seemed to fall apart, and now he was gone, lost to the war. She needed him, and for years she searched the galaxy for any trace of him. Her search took her to far-off planets and deep into enemy lines, but every lead turned out to be another dead end. Yet, Neera never gave up. She couldn't. David had made her a promise. If they ever parted ways, they would reunite. And that promise was one Neera held on to, no matter how impossible it seemed. One evening, Neera stood on the bridge of the Resistance flagship, the Phoenix, gazing out into the cold expanse of space. Her eyes were tired, filled with the weight of years of fighting, but they still burned with determination. The stars in front of her seemed to twinkle with the possibility of hope, just as they had when she first met David. A voice broke her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. "Commander Neera," a young officer said, his tone serious. "We've intercepted a communication from the Thraxian capital. It's urgent." Neera turned to face him, her brow furrowing. "What is it?" "We've found something unusual," the officer continued. "A Thraxian facility on the Outer Rim is holding a prisoner, one who matches the description of a human soldier believed to have been killed in action years ago." Neera's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? "Where is this facility?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of hope. The officer quickly showed her a holographic map. "It's located on Varkin 7, a desolate moon in the Thraxian system. It's heavily guarded, but we believe this soldier may be valuable." If it is him, Neera didn't need him to finish the sentence. The prisoner might be David, the soldier who had saved her life so many years ago. Without hesitation, Neera made her decision. "Prepare a strike team," she ordered. "We're going to Varkin 7. The journey to Varkin 7 was long, and the tension on the Phoenix was palpable. Neera barely spoke to anyone, lost in her thoughts. She had imagined this moment countless times, wondering what it would feel like to finally find David. Would he remember her? Would he be the same person, or would the years of war and hardship have changed him beyond recognition? When they finally arrived at Varkin 7, the desolate moon seemed to stretch endlessly beneath them. The surface was barren, covered in dust and rocks, with no signs of life. The Thraxian facility stood like a dark monument against the harsh landscape, a foreboding reminder of the enemy they had fought so long to defeat. Neera stood at the command center of their shuttle, staring at the facility in the distance. The team around her was ready for the mission, each soldier prepared for whatever lay ahead. But Neera's heart was pounding in her chest. This wasn't just another mission. This was personal. "Ready when you are, Commander," one of her officers said, pulling her from her thoughts. Neera nodded. "Let's move." The shuttle descended toward the facility, cloaking itself from Thraxian sensors as it approached. Once it touched down on the moon's surface, the team quickly disembarked, moving swiftly and silently toward the entrance. The air was thin and the gravity was weak, making every movement feel slightly off. But Nira barely noticed, her focus solely on the mission ahead. They reached the facility's gates, which were heavily guarded by Thraxian soldiers. Nira signaled her team to take cover, and within moments the enemy forces were neutralized. It was a quick and efficient operation, a testament to Nira's leadership. She led the charge, her mind focused on one thing: finding David. The facility's interior was cold and sterile, its walls lined with harsh fluorescent lights. As they moved deeper into the building, the silence was broken only by the faint hum of machinery and the occasional distant thud of doors closing. Nira's heart raced as they reached the holding cells. They were close. "Third cell on the right," one of the officers whispered, pointing to a reinforced door. Nira's breath caught in her throat. This was it. She approached the door, her hand hovering over the control panel. For a moment she hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. If this was truly David, she didn't know what to expect. Would he remember her? Would he be the same soldier who had once fought by her side? With a swift motion, Nira opened the door. Inside the dimly lit cell, a figure was seated on the floor, his back turned. His hair was ragged and his clothing was torn and stained. He looked gaunt, his body thinner than it should have been, but there was something unmistakable about him. The sharp angles of his face, the way he sat, his posture was familiar. "David!" Nira's voice trembled as she called out his name. The man turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room before they settled on her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He stood up, his movements stiff and mechanical, as though he wasn't used to moving freely anymore. "Nira!" His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in years, but there was no mistaking it. It was him, the soldier who had saved her life. Nira took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "David, it's really you." For a moment he just stood there, staring at her as if he couldn't believe it. The room seemed to grow colder, the weight of the years between them settling in. Then finally he spoke again. "I remember you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I remember saving you, but I don't remember anything after that. I've been lost." Tears welled up in Nira's eyes, but she held them back. This was David, but he was different, changed. The man she had known was buried beneath layers of time, war, and something darker. He wasn't the same soldier who had rescued her on Ithra, but he was still David. And that was all that mattered. "We'll fix that," Nira said softly. "You're safe now." David's eyes softened, but there was something distant in his gaze. He hadn't just been lost physically. He had been lost in ways that Nira couldn't yet understand. But she would help him find his way back. They would fight together once more as they had before. "Thank you," David said, his voice filled with gratitude and pain. "I don't know what happened, but I'm glad you're here." Nira smiled, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and sorrow. They had found each other, but there was still so much to overcome. The war wasn't over, and David, he was a different person now. But together they could rebuild what had been broken. Together they could bring an end to the Thraxian Empire. The air inside the Thraxian facility felt thick and heavy, the silence pressing in on them as Nira and David stood in front of each other. After all these years, after all the battles and losses, they had finally reunited. But as much as Nira felt a rush of relief, there was still a deep unease. David wasn't the same soldier she had once known. He had changed. The man she had fought alongside, the one who had saved her life, now stood before her, a shadow of that person. His eyes, though familiar, were clouded with confusion and pain. Nira could see it in his posture, the stiffness in his movements, the hesitation in his voice. David wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a weapon, broken and bent by the Thraxians. They had done something to him, something that went beyond the physical. And now it was up to her to help him find his way back. The moment they had been waiting for was here. The mission was a success. They had found David, and now they had to escape. The Thraxian facility, though not yet on full alert, was bound to send reinforcements. Time was running out. Neera, David's voice broke through her thoughts. He was looking at her with uncertainty, still processing everything that had happened. I don't know how to fight anymore. I don't know who I am. Neera reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Her touch was soft but firm, a reminder that she was here for him, that she hadn't given up on him. "You're still David," she said, her voice steady, "and you're not alone. We'll fix this together." David looked at her for a moment, his eyes searching hers as if trying to remember something. Finally, he nodded, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "We need to go now," Neera said, her voice sharp. They had no time to waste. The escape route was only a few hundred meters away, but the Thraxians would be hunting them soon. The team moved quickly, securing David and heading back toward the shuttle bay. Neera's heart raced as they passed the facility's silent corridors, the only sound the quick footsteps of the soldiers. She couldn't afford to look back, couldn't afford to wonder if they would be caught. She focused on the mission: get David back to safety, regroup with the fleet, and prepare for the next step in the war. As they approached the shuttle bay, they encountered their first major obstacle: a group of heavily armed Thraxian soldiers. Neera didn't hesitate. She signaled to her team, and they quickly fell into formation, surrounding the enemy soldiers. David's hand instinctively went to his weapon, but Neera stopped him. "No," she said, shaking her head. "This isn't you. Let us handle this." David looked at her, the confusion still evident in his eyes. For a moment he seemed lost, but then something clicked. He stepped back, allowing Neera and her team to take charge. There was no hesitation in their movements. They worked together like a well-oiled machine, swiftly taking down the Thraxians without a single shot fired by David. It was strange, and Neera could tell that it was a struggle for him, but he was willing to follow her lead. The shuttle bay doors loomed ahead. The team moved toward the open ramp, and Neera felt a sense of urgency press on her chest. The escape was within reach, but so was the enemy. They had to move faster. Just as they reached the shuttle, an alarm blared across the facility. Red lights flashed, signaling the arrival of Thraxian reinforcements. David tensed, his body instinctively preparing for battle, but Neera shook her head. "Not this time," she said firmly. "We're getting out of here." The shuttle's engines hummed to life, and they lifted off, breaking through the moon's atmosphere and heading toward the safety of the fleet. The Thraxians were in pursuit, but Neera knew the Phoenix and the other resistance ships were ready to defend them. As they flew through space, Neera sat beside David, her eyes focused on the stars ahead. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope. They had made it out and David was alive, but their work was far from over. The mission was successful, but David's journey was only just beginning. Neera knew that bringing him back from the edge of the Thraxians' control wouldn't be easy. He had been altered, shaped into something different, and it would take time to help him find himself again. But Neera was determined to help him heal. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, glancing at David. He was staring out the window, his eyes distant, lost in thought. "I don't know," he said after a moment, his voice low. "I don't know who I am anymore, Neera. I don't know if I'll ever be the same." Neera reached out, placing her hand gently on his arm. "You don't have to be the same," she said. "You're still David, and that's all that matters. We'll figure this out together." David's eyes softened as he turned to look at her. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on me." The journey back to the fleet was long, but Neera didn't mind. She sat beside David, talking to him when he was ready to talk, allowing him to remain silent when he needed to. She could see the battle inside him, the struggle between who he had been and who he was now. But with every passing moment, she saw a glimmer of the man he once was. It wasn't gone. It was still there, buried deep inside him, waiting to be rediscovered. When they finally arrived at the Phoenix, the crew gave them a warm welcome. Neera, though exhausted, felt a sense of accomplishment. They had made it. They had survived, but the war was still raging. The Thraxians hadn't been defeated yet. Their next move would be crucial. And though Neera had won this small victory, bringing David back, she knew that the battle for the future of humanity was far from over. In the days that followed, Neera worked closely with David, helping him recover from the trauma he had endured. They trained together, spoke about their past, and slowly the pieces of the old David began to emerge. He wasn't the same person he had been before the war, but he was still David, and that was enough. Neera had always believed in hope, even when it seemed impossible. And now, with David by her side, she believed in the future more than ever. The Thraxians had taken so much from them, but they hadn't taken everything. As long as they had each other, there was still a chance for a better future. The war would continue. But with Neera and David fighting together once more, the Thraxians would know that they had underestimated humanity's will to survive. They would fight. They would win. And together they would rebuild.